All right, welcome back, everybody. Our next session, I know folks are still coming in, but I want to keep us on time in part with some of the virtual participants. We'll be on strong authenticated remote access to industrial critical infrastructure. Don Shin will be our presenter. He's from Secret Double Octopus. Your company might think you have a great brand name, but it is not as cool as Secret Double Octopus. So, Don, over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Dave. Yeah, that's actually the number one question people always ask is, where did that name come from? So thank you for joining the session. I think that this is sort of a very serious topic in the sense that the mission of the people that are here is to bring this technology to do good, right? And so what we know today is we've learned a lot about living without essentials, right? The colonial pipeline incidents, there's so many that are happening throughout the world, but it really came to head here, right? Was during COVID. We came to realize that there's a lot of things that are really critical and that are very, very hard to live without, right? Everybody needed those shopping carts full of toilet paper. And we see this types of things happening. So as a result of this, what's happening is these mandates are coming into place in pretty much everywhere around the world, right? And it's falling straight in at the heart of what everybody here is about, which is authentication, right? And so in the US, President Biden made the declaration in 2022, was reinforcing the 2013 about, hey, we have to protect our infrastructure, right? And so he picked 18 industries that are now being pushed down regulations, and the top line requirement is MFA. Right? And we see this happening in Europe too, because earlier this year, well, I guess it was the ratification of NIS2, right, in Europe, and then the guidances that are coming up to it is all about strong authentication. Number one requirement, and of course, the EU, they don't tell you what to do. They say, member states, you ought to do this, kind of like that approach, right? But at the end of the day, there's teeth inside of those requirements because it has a 3%, I think it's a 3% annual penalty for not being able to comply with this, right? And so a lot of change is underway. And then we compound this with these particular industries in that they've got a real problem, right? They're getting hacked by nation state specifically, right? They're going into these particular environments. It's very obvious when an attack has happened because downtime for an oil processing or a manufacturing plant, it's always in the news, right? And we compound that on the other side of it is these mandates that we're pushing forward on these organizations is that it's really challenging because change for these organizations is coming from success, right? It's very hard to find energy-producing companies that haven't been around for five decades possibly, right? And so they've accumulated a tremendous amount of technical debt based on success, right? Rather than the unicorn types of things that can build everything based on a SaaS or a delivery service, right? And there is a tremendous amount of on-premises portions of these types of organizations, right? And this is the sort of the challenge that these organizations face. And then architecturally, things don't work also. So fundamentally, the core technology of MFA, it doesn't work in critical infrastructures, right? In particular, it has to do with, foundationally, is that the architectures that they build are based around what's called the Purdue model, right? With these layers of Purdue models, and there's always an air gap inside of there, right? You have these DMZs that have no internet connectivity inside of it because we sure don't want, we don't want attackers or unauthorized people coming into these particular facilities, either digitally or physically, right? And so it's a real big challenge that's been set forth with that small declaration of, hey, you have to get to MFA, right? And And so we look at this a little bit more, right? I mean, for us, this is all of the objective here is to get to strong authentication. Let's get rid of the something you know and make sure that we go towards the something that we have and something that you are. And so these things that we've been talking about with passkeys, the various types of passkeys, and other passwordless technology is really, really important. Right? So, oh, what happened there? Odd font. So what that was supposed to say is the mandate is MFA, but so why should it be passwordless MFA, right? And it's pretty clear for all of us, right? Is that, hey, one is the attack surface. We slash the attack surface because we know that phishing and password exploits account for some 82% of all of the security attacks, the origination of ransomware and any kind of data theft, right? And then the productivity gains, right? There was a BBC report. I mean, we talk about seconds, whatnot, and we would multiply that by large numbers. But what BBC reported was that on average, people spend 22 minutes a day interfacing with their technologies, authenticating in and out. You know, that's a really big number, right? Which is about 5%. That's amazing. And then obviously the return on investment is something that these businesses also want, just like any other business. Yeah? So when we come to these organizations with the benefits of passwordless, there's this thing that occurs, right? And it's what I call it is cognitive dissonance. Right? And you talk to any kind of IT leader in any of these organizations, they look over to the left and they think, passwords, take the passwords from users. I say, yeah, I get that. Yeah, absolutely. Let's go get the passwords out of the users. Then they turn around and look at the infrastructure and they say, no way, right? That's almost impossible. And the constraints that we're putting on the technology that we're bringing out is basically saying, hey, re-architect everything. Move all of your applications into this particular format. And remember, authentication is a marriage of three things, right? The user, the app, and the directory. And it's the solutions that we're providing out there are taking mostly care of the user and the app and saying, hey, but that's your problem is the application and the directory and the application, but the user, but the application. So now they have to be responsible for getting this thing converted into a format that they can use. And so this creates a tremendous amount of friction for adoption pretty much everywhere, right? But especially for enterprises and especially for these types of critical things that we as people depend on, right? So what we have to do is we have to take this concept of passwordless and we actually have to separate it into two parts, right? There is the part of it which is the authentication portion of it with the passwordless. At least this is some of the things that have to be done. And the other portion is the infrastructure, right? And so we'll kind of go into this a little bit more. Now, when we think about the FIDO in particular for these types of programs, you can see what's the problem? FIDO is great, but it only works with web apps, right? And enterprises, all enterprises, are much, much more than web apps, right? And so we have to figure out a way that we can bridge the gap because the reality of it is that enterprises, when they're deploying new technologies, are still deploying more on-prem than they are SaaS-based platforms, right? And I think that we missed that portion of it, so we have to figure out how do we solve this for these enterprises in particular, because they're filled with other things. Like one of the common things that happens inside of factory floors is shared accounts, right? Because, for example, you know, they have shift workers coming in and changing perpetually. And just think about how long it takes to provision somebody on a Windows platform, right? A new user that you added to the platform. Well, they're going to sit there for 30 minutes waiting for the thing to come up, right? For every time a new user gets added. And it's just the nature of the work that happens. Or I guess this on premises in general. So I had some demos to show, how do you take phytotechnology and how do you translate this into working with these types of applications as well. That unfortunately, there's not a mouse up here. I didn't anticipate that. Yeah. Okay. So it's this whole slew of things that have to be filled using this key technology that we're talking about here with passkeys, and whether they're hardware or software passkeys, and how do we stretch this out for the rest of these applications? Now, the other challenge for these kinds of organizations is that the way that they do their work is very different than just a typical enterprise, right? Of course, there's the whole corporate portion of it, and as we're moving down the layers of the Purdue model towards the production floor. But just as importantly is that there is a heavy component of employees, and sometimes it could be looked at as a third. A third of them are contractors, and then a third of them are vendor technicians. Right? The Schneiders of the world, they're the ones that actually maintain and run the systems. It's not the employees that do that. Right? And so the question becomes, how do we get all of these diverse workforces to be able to access these systems? And especially today, the biggest challenge is after COVID is that they're all going remote. Right? All of these facilities tend to be very remote. They can be filled with shadow IT if we can't solve this particular problem for them, for how to be able to access these systems remotely. Right? And so inside of this Purdue model, what we have is, I'm going to show you a demo. So what we're talking about is this set of employees, contractors, and vendor technicians of how do they crawl through the layers. And the main thing to note here is that this is one of the big problems, is this air gap DMZ. Right? There's no internet connectivity from that particular point. And so how do we authenticate the people from that perspective, right? And so in this next demo I'm going to show you, what we're going to do is step one is first we have to get strong authentication onto the desktop. Right? We have to have MFA with absolute certainty of that this particular user has privileges to be able to get on there. Then the next step that we need to do is we have to VPN into the corporate environment so that we can get access as we're moving south through the Purdue model, right? Then we have to cross the air gap, would be the next thing that we have to cross, right? And so we'll show you an air gap method for MFA, whether you're using tokens or using mobile push. In this example, we'll show push all the way through. And then finally, you cross into the layer 3 portion of it, where usually you have jump servers to be able to access any of the equipment. You don't ever directly access any of the equipment, right? That's sort of by standards. And then lastly, is if you're inside the infrastructure, then what you would do is you start to use tokens inside of it, because once again, there is no internet connectivity out there. Okay? So let's go ahead and show you an example of how this might be done. All right. So in the first phase, we're going to desktop MFA using mobile push and use biometrics to be able to log into here. Now, we could just as easily have used a FIDO token to be able to do this. Right? So now now we're on to the desktop. The next thing we have to do is we have to VPN into the corporate infrastructure. Right? So once again, we're going to use passwordless techniques so that we're getting into a radius-based VPN server. We get a mobile push out here. We do a biometric check in order to be able to cross that particular boundary. Okay, and now what we need to do is we need to jump into the DMZ, jump into or across the DMZ. And here what we're going to do is we're going to start a remote desktop session on a jump server sitting inside of the DMZ air gap. And so what we end up doing here is we use a biometrically protected OTP that's synchronized with the server inside of the air gap. So now we jump into this particular host, and once again, we did strong authentication because we've proven the biometric and possession before they're able to see the token. And then now we're into the DMZ, and now we need to jump into the layer 3 tier. And so we do a nested RDP session inside here, and once again, have another identity here, Bob the air gap here. And he has it. So these are all unfederated directories inside of each of the layers of the production environment, which is really common for how these particular systems are built. Okay? And so finally, we've jumped into, now we've nested three times we've nested inside of it, and we end up finally inside the air gap where we can start to actually access all of the rest of the equipment. Okay? So what does that mean? It's all about the diversity of the use cases, right? Of all of the different types of things that have to happen inside of these businesses that we have such a strong dependence on, right? Which is all of the various types of desktops, the shared accounts, even facilitating bring your own devices, and then it's all the corporate applications, the line of business applications. They also have to get to this point where we can give them passwordless strong authentication technology, and then give them, I thought the Amazon, what is his name? My Coleslaw. His talk was good about providing flexibility as far as the authentication methods that have to be there, right? And push and FIDO tokens, all of these kinds of technologies are going to be needed in order to be able to get them to the strong authentication. Okay, that's all I had, and yeah.
Any questions from anybody?
What's the name? What's the name?
The name, okay. Yeah, it comes from one of our founders' thesis of how information is communicated. And so we have like the idea of two octopus tenants where all of our data is always sent over multiple channels so that they can't be reassembled. Okay. So it's kind of a boring answer to sort of a cool name. Okay.
I mean, with the model that you just explained, do you also support authentication to legacy systems like mainframe, RACF?
Yes. So what we're doing is you have to think about, in the world of FIDO, it only knows this language, right? And it's end to end. And what happens is that our system basically translates strong authentication, but we leave the infrastructure for passwords. We manage the password so that we're rotating the password constantly, okay, for each of the users, and the user never knows the password, right? But when we end up proxying it to the application and to the directory with the password itself, okay? Or if the system's ready for an SSO or for FIDO, we also are a FIDO2 server so that we sit in front of, we can provide the IDP, or we give the IDP the instruction on what to do.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions? I'm also looking online. We don't have anybody else. All right, if not, I think we'll end a few minutes early. Our next session will be coming up at 12:30, so thank you, everybody.